Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Larimer. I am the editor-in-chief of Poets and Writers. And I want to thank you all for joining us here for a very special event featuring author Garth Greenwell in conversation with Brian Gresko. We're going to get started soon, but first, a very important reminder. Please ensure that you stay muted throughout the program. We're going to be hearing a short reading by Garth, followed by a conversation with Brian, and we will reserve some time after that for questions from the audience. You are sincerely invited to drop your questions for Garth and Brian in the chat at the bottom of your screen. Questions about Garth's new book, Small Rain, or about his writing process, or just about anything to do with writing. Those questions will be shared with Brian, and I know they'll try to get to all of them a little later in the program. Please do consider subscribing to Poets and Writers Magazine so we can continue offering this kind of programming and keep publishing beautiful, dynamic profiles of authors, such as the one Brian wrote about Garth in our current issue. We'll provide a link in the chat to our subscription page. And of course, also, please consider purchasing Small Rain from your local bookstore or at Bookshop. Again, a link will be provided in the chat for that. And now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our featured guests, Garth Greenwell and Brian Gresko. Brian is a writer and illustrator based in Brooklyn, New York. Their work has appeared on Slate, Long Reads, The Atlantic, The Rumpus, the LA Review of Books, and in the Sun magazine, and of course, Poets and Writers magazine, for which, over the years, he has written profiles and conducted interviews with R.O. Kwon, Kate Zambrano, Melissa Febos, Karen Russell, Lauren Vandenberg, and others. In 2014, Brian edited the anthology When I First Held You. 22 critically acclaimed writers talk about the triumphs, challenges, and transformative experience of fatherhood. They co-run the esteemed Pete's Reading Series in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and they are a founding member of Writing CoLab, an artist-owned teaching cooperative. And our featured author is none other than Garth Greenwell. Garth is the author of 3 exquisite novels. What Belongs to You, which won the British Book Award for Debut of the Year, was longlisted for the 2016 National Book Award, and was a finalist for 6 other awards, including the PEN/Faulkner Award, the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. A New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, it was named a Best Book of the Year by over 50 publications in 9 countries. It's been translated into 14 languages. His second novel, Cleanness, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and was longlisted for the Gordon Byrne Prize, the Joyce Carol Oates Prize, and other honors. Cleanness was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2020, a New York Times Critics Top 10 Book of the Year, and a Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker, Time Magazine, NPR, the BBC, and over 30 other publications. But it is Garth's new novel that brings us together now. Small Rain, published earlier this week by FSG, is set in the American Midwest over a handful of days early in the pandemic. The story begins when a writer, relatively young and healthy, anchored by a domestic life with the man he loves, suddenly becomes a body on an ICU bed, racked with unbearable pain. He's surrounded by strangers who, like him, struggle to understand what's gone wrong. In The Triumph of a Heart, the cover profile of the author in our current issue, Garth recalls wondering, quote, "Can I make a book about a guy lying in a bed for 10 days? Can that be a novel? And if that's the narrative shape of the book, then what else can fill it? The whole idea of a protagonist is predicated on action, change, agency. How can you have a protagonist from whom all those things have been taken?" And yet, Brian writes, Small Rain is the exact opposite of lethargic or dull. It pulses with vitality. Kaveh Akbar calls it a classic, a dawn serenade, a little miracle of exigent joy. So I am thrilled to have both Garth and Brian with us here now to discuss exactly how Garth accomplished this literary feat of first-person narration. So without further delay, I'll pass the screen to Garth Greenwell, who will read from Small Rain. Garth, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Kevin, and thank you for that really beautiful introduction. And thank you to all of you who are here. It was wonderful as the screen was populating to see some familiar faces Before we begin, I just want to thank Brian Gresko for the really beautiful profile, and also for being here tonight to take part in this conversation. So I'm going to read a very short, it's a single paragraph. Well, that doesn't always mean very short in my books, but it's not very long. And this is from towards the end of the first chapter of the book. The narrator is not yet in the ICU. He's still in the ER. He's waiting for an ICU bed to open up. And he's being taken care of by an ER nurse named Frank, who's kind of the first caregiver he really sort of establishes a connection with. Um, and he's just had an allergic reaction, to like a minor allergic reaction, but Frank is sticking around and they're talking as Frank waits to make sure that the narrator is going to be okay. And Frank reveals that he had studied music in college, and this presents a point of contact. I had been a voice major, I told him then. Before I studied literature, I had had a start as a musician and had given it up too. Really, he said, interested, and he asked me what part I sang, what repertoire. I told him a bit of the story, how I had come to music late, too late probably, that I was never happy with what I could hear, that I could never think in music, that it was always a foreign language. And also that I was a student in a conservative department, that my teacher wanted me to focus on standard rep while my interest drew me elsewhere to new music and early music, that my best experiences were with an early music ensemble the school was famous for, led by a brilliant lutenist at whose name Frank lit up. I know him, he said. I've listened to him for years. He loved early music too, he said, early choral music. He loved singing it. His entire demeanor had changed now. He was buzzing with excitement as he told me he had gotten obsessed recently with John Tavener, a Renaissance composer I had sung at school. We had studied him in music history too, when we learned about the use of popular songs in religious music, a mixture of the secular and the sacred, whole masses built on La Marmee or Western Wind, which was what Frank played me now. You've got to hear this, he said. He had pulled his phone from the pocket of his scrubs and was scrolling through his music. It was an old recording of Tavener's Mass, but he had just discovered it. I miss the real thing, he said, owning records and CDs. But it's amazing to have everything in your phone, absolutely everything. Here it is, he said, holding his phone up to listen. There was a moment of silence then, a pause while the song loaded, and then a solo tenor voice filled the room, tinny on the phone speakers, but still beautiful, an English tenor. I don't mean the singer's nationality, but the type of voice. It's a peculiar sound, bright and unforced, lyric, pure somehow, nothing like Italian or German voices. Maybe it's that you can hear the boys' choir in it in the shape of the vowels. And this tenor was very good. His voice rang out, not operatic, but in an early style, mostly straight tone, but vibrating just slightly on the sustained notes. It was a warm voice, full of light. Frank had come close to the bed, aiming his phone at me, and he leaned toward me too, bending his head so we could listen together. I was surprised by how well I remembered the tune. It had been so long ago that I had sung it, and I had come to think of the words free of music. It was one of my favorite poems, authorless, mysterious, the first two lines unparsable. Western wind, when wilt thou blow? The small rain down can rain. A sentence with a broken back. I had taught it for years to high schoolers. I had encouraged them to imagine the speaker, somebody in trouble, a soldier maybe, alone, exposed to the elements, and not just to the elements. Think of the significance of the West, the direction the sun sets, the region of death. Could he be longing for death? I would ask them. Is he at that pitch of extremity? And what is the small rain? Isn't it beautiful? The weird adjective. How can rain be small? And does he want it? the speaker of the poem? Does he long for the rain? Is that how we should understand the cracked syntax? And isn't the poem more beautiful for it, for the difficulty, for the way we can't quite make sense of its settled sense, I mean, for how it won't stay still? Isn't the nonsense what makes it bottomless? What lets us pour and pour our attention into it? What makes it not just a message, though it is a message, I would say to them. All art is a message. We want to communicate something, but maybe not an entirely graspable something. Maybe there's a kind of sense only nonsense can convey, so that the poem becomes not just a message, but an object of contemplation, of devotion, even inexhaustible. It had been my whole life puzzling over phrases, trying to account for the unaccountable in what art makes us feel. It had been my whole life. Sometimes it had seemed a full life, and sometimes a wasted one. It had felt full and wasted at once. The poem goes on. The second half makes an easier kind of sense. Christ, if my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again. An easier kind of sense, but I heard it in a new way listening to it with Frank. I felt my eyes fill with tears. After the tenor solo, the mass proper begins, the tune in the sopranos first, with the words not of the poem, but of the Gloria et in terra pax. Frank let it play for a moment, the Renaissance polyphony that always sounds to me like petals opening, a rose blooming in time-lapse photography. I'm embarrassed by the image. It was something I felt as a teenager, and I still feel it now. Well, Frank said, when he finally stopped the music, not abruptly, he lowered the volume first. Well, thanks, guys. I'll stop there.
Uh, Thank you, Garth. Thank you so much. Um, I want to. I've got some questions about this part. This part that you read. First, though, I do want to just remind the audience, as those questions, if you have questions as they come up, please put them in the chat. But Garth, I'm so glad you read this part because it encapsulates for me so much of a real synecdoche of what's happening in the novel. This movement between the health crisis and then this kind of essayistic meditation on art, and then which leads into the thinking about the meaning of life, of the narrator's life, and of love, and this connection that's happening between the narrator and the caregiver. Could you unpack this for us a little bit, just how it developed and why? I guess a specific question: why this John Taverner composition? Why, of all the songs or poems, why this one?
Because I needed the poem. I needed the poem. And I needed the poem, you know, at some point, as I was writing the first scenes of this book, I understood that it was going to be, well, I understood that it was a book about someone who, in his early 40s, decades before he thinks, you know, he imagines he will have to confront this question, has to confront the question of what his life has meant. You know, one of the first things he hears when he's admitted to the ER, one of the vascular surgeons who's examining him tells him, "You could die from this." And over the first days that he spends in the hospital, it very much seems possible that he could die. And so to ask the question, okay, if this is it at 43, 44, whatever he is, if this is it, what has my life been about? And his life has been about art. And I understood pretty early on that the book needed to be made out of experiences of art. And this is almost the first. There's one that comes earlier that's also quite important. That's also about music, about a singer named Kathleen Ferrier. But this is the first time. That earlier moment all happens in his head. His doctor, one of the surgeons' name is Ferrier, Dr. Ferrier. And so this sort of makes him remember this thing in his head. This is the first time that we see art form a connection between people. And it occurs to me, it had not occurred to me before, but just reading it, I mean, this was something that was totally unplanned, but the fact that, the narrator says the first words of the Gloria, et in terra pax, like, peace on earth. Well, that's one of the crucial things the narrator is going to be thinking about. I mean, in this bed, which has swept him out of the, at the beginning of the book, he experiences this annihilating pain. And this pain kind of sweeps him out of the world, sweeps him out of his home, sweeps him out of his life into this ICU bed. But while he's there, he's going to think an awful lot about the world, his house, his life. And one of the things he's going to be thinking about is the way that just as his body is breaking down, he thinks about how his house, which maybe we'll talk about, but his house, which has been he's a new homeowner, it's been a complete disaster. His house is falling apart. And also he meditates a lot. The book is set in August 2020 at the time of the George Floyd protests, and also of, the intensity of an approaching election. And he meditates on the fact that the country is falling apart. And he thinks a lot about, what is sort of the minimum necessary to keep his body going? What is the minimum necessary to keep his house standing up? And what is like the minimal necessity of civilization understood as like, what are the conditions that allow us to live side by side without killing each other? And so it just occurred to me only now as I was reading it that the fact that at the very beginning of the book you have et in terra pax also kind of casts a line across across the book. But yeah, the reason Taverner's in the book is because I wanted Western Wind to be in the book. This is a poem that I love, and it's a poem that I do think is an expression of this kind of bare existential need and existential extremity. And that's the situation in which the narrator finds himself.
Well, and it's interesting that, yeah, the very kind of moment is similar, right? In that this kind of outside thing comes in and it sparks this, reverie that the narrator takes. So did you, these kind of layers of like the one moment opening up into many layers of, that, like, as you said, allow you to go into these different moments of the narrator's life and experience. How much of that was just happened in the composition process for you organically, and how much was planned out? Like, so like, were you like, okay, here's some of the things, the pieces of music that I want to bring into the book, or did you just allow it to happen as it happened?
Yeah, no, I don't write from a plan. I experience writing as like a profound inhabitation of ignorance and bewilderment. Writers that I love, like Anne Patchett, who is one of my favorite writers. I remember reading an interview with her where she said, I can't begin a novel until I've outlined every scene. I know exactly how it's going to work. I know exactly how it's going to end. That to me, I mean, clearly it's a brilliant idea because it works. Like the proof of the theory is her novels. But to me, that is bonkers. Like I could never do that. And I have the experience very much, what you're talking about, sort of layers and the ways that like things, something that excites me when I'm writing and that makes me think that maybe I'm not writing entirely terribly in that moment is when those kinds of apertures happen and things open up. And I think the technology that allows for that is the sentence. This sort of peculiar sentence that I am drawn to, which has a history, which is a sentence that is at once, I mean, I hope, this may all just be a fantasy, but I hope is sort of rhythmically propulsive and has a kind of force pulling you forward, but is also constantly falling back and correcting itself and sort of asking, are there other ways sort of this thought could go? It's a sort of sentence of ambivalence, and it's a sentence of exploration and of discovery. And I really do feel that, sentences, I say this all the time, sentences for me are not containers for thought, but tools for thinking. And sometimes I think of them as like heat-seeking devices. And like they're always sort of turning toward where is the point of greater heat in this moment, in this scene, in this reverie, And so it's the sentence itself that I find all the time, in thinking about Western Wind, he uses these metaphors of like a broken back, cracked sentence, these metaphors of breaking and cracking. In part, I think because that's something that's happening. Like what has happened to him is that the inner wall of his aorta has torn. So there's like a kind of devastating cracking happening inside his body. But it's also a way, whenever a sentence cracks like that, it creates a space of possibility, and sort of something else can rush in, and wherever the sentence thought it was going, all of a sudden it's going something else. And that's a movement that I find really exciting. And I don't try to engineer it, but I try to sort of write within a space that makes that kind of cracking and leaping and swerving possible.
It's amazing, truly. And I feel like you see this style develop in book after book, and I think here it does feel different in that the way that consciousness is happening. And I wonder, maybe because of also just the physical, the narrator cannot move from that bed, or move often from that bed, or move easily from that bed, right? So the conditions for being internal and allowing that deep thought to happen are perfectly set up by the narrative situation.
Oh, I like that you say that. That's beautiful. And I do feel that like limitation allows for grand movement, in a way.
Yeah. Working within constraints sometimes can be quite expansive. And I did my best to touch on your writing practice in the profile, but I think people would benefit from hearing about it firsthand, because I find it so interesting to hear you talk specifically about your notebooks. But could you tell us a little bit just about like your, just from a process standpoint, when you write and the way in which you organize your notebook?
Oh, well, I do actually really love like nerding out about notebooks. And my notebook process has actually changed. So now I am sort of innovating in my notebooks and doing things differently from how I did it with Small Rain. With Small Rain is continuous with how I wrote my first two books as well. I started writing fiction after more than 20 years of real devotion to poetry. I started studying poetry my junior year of at university, where I took a mind-blowing class with a brilliant man who died a couple of years ago, far too young, named James Longenbach, who made me feel, he seemed like a priest of poetry, and he made me feel that a life devoted to poetry would be the noblest possible life. I still believe that. I feel that being a novelist is just kind of grossly degraded as a vocation, as opposed to being a poet. But when I was a poet, I composed everything on the computer, because like I had this desperate need for like the clean field. And so like when I was writing a poem, when I wanted to change something, I would push everything down and rewrite on sort of the pure white, snowy field of the screen. But I found when I started writing poetry or writing prose, what happened was I had finished a manuscript of poems. I put it in a drawer and I thought, I'm just going to let it sit for like 6 months. I thought I wasn't going to write anything for a while. I had just moved to Bulgaria. I was living abroad. I was working as a high school teacher. I was really intensely studying the language. And I thought, oh, well, my writing energy will go into language study. But I started feeling these sentences that the only way I can explain it, I never, ever, ever, I never would have. Like, it would never have occurred to me to say, I'm going to make a decision to be a prose writer. Like, that would just, that would just, why in the world would you do that? And it was actually quite traumatic for me when I started feeling these sentences that I knew were not broken into lines. And I tried to write on the computer and it didn't work. And so I moved to a notebook. And I remember there were, so in Bulgaria, sort of along the road that I walked to my school, which was like a mile from my apartment, and I walked it every morning. And it was like still dark. And there were these little kiosks along the way that, I mean, sold all sorts of things, but there was a kiosk that sold school supplies. And so I went in and I got these little spiral bound notebooks that were like for children. They were like wide marked. They were, wide ruled. Is that what we say? Wide ruled. They had like
Mm-hmm.
wonderful pictures on the cover. And that initiated this tradition of like, in order to be able to write fiction, certainly for the first three books, I had to write in like the cheapest notebooks possible with like really cheap pens. Like there are so many writers who like a sense of ceremony and they have like leather bound. No, that's absolutely not. I can't do it. And so I write by hand. I write messily. I love post-it notes. Like I love it when I went to make an insertion. I use post-it notes, and I write on one side of the page and leave the verso blank. And so, I also like, as I am writing, I'm a big believer that when you're working on a novel, your only job is to move forward. Like, I think, and again, no one knows how to write. The only question is, does it work for you? And there are some very great writers, including one of my teachers, Kevin Brockmeyer, who says he perfects every sentence before he moves to the next. Again, like that works because his books are wonderful, but to me it is bonkers. I think you move forward, you don't try to edit, you don't try to fix anything, because you can't know until you have a draft. Like you can't know if the first line is right until you have a whole draft of the novel. So I write messily, I try to just move forward, and when I know there's a problem, like when I've been writing for 5 pages and I think this section is really stupid, that's what the verso is for. I like make a note about the problem, something to return to. But now my notebooks are changing and I've gotten obsessed with dotted notebooks, and like
Mm.
I like to like set up pages in various ways. I haven't done that for fiction yet. That's all been nonfiction. And I really love like creating like a workshop for thinking on the page. Like there are lots of boxes and sort of lines drawn across, and I've written Substacks about this. So if you want to see pictures, you can go to my Substack, To a Green Thought, and look at the pictures that I've put up. But my notebook, anyway, I'm a big believer in writing it by hand. And the kind of sentence that I talk about, I think I could not feel that sentence if I weren't like writing with a pen in my hand on notebook paper.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah,
Talk
no,
about
I
this.
love hearing
I
you
love
could.
this.
Yeah, notebooks are right, and the organization of a notebook. And no, I was yeah, no, I love it. And and I think the other thing that kind of came up, kind of moving off of that, like kind of thinking about like attuning to thought on the page, and thinking in that the passage that you read about the value of a life devoted to art. I know from your Substack, which everyone should subscribe to because it is wonderful, that you see a lot of movies. I don't know. Did you see the Brian Eno documentary that Gary Hustwit directed?
No, I haven't.
Eno.
I haven't.
Okay.
No.
Okay. All right. So like music producer. Work Bowie and U2 and all these people. And anyway, but he said that he feels that an artist is not defined by what they produce. That being an artist is a philosophical approach, kind of a way of being in the world. And I heard that, and I thought of you, and I thought of this book. And so what does it mean for you to be an artist?
Yeah. I mean, I agree very much that it is not about the product. It is certainly not about feeling like, oh, I have made something that I know is a great masterwork and that gives meaning to my life. Actually, I think one of the great solitudes of being an artist is that we never know the value of what we've made. We know that no one can tell us the value of what we've made. Their critics are wrong all the time. Books that win prizes like are bad. We know that bad books win prizes. We know that bad books sell 1 million copies. We know that great books go totally unheeded. So external circumstance can't tell us, but also our own valuation, or my own valuation, swings all the time. I write something in the moment I think, oh, it's going so well. And then I look at it the next day and I think, what was I on? Like, what were you thinking? This is terrible. And then I look at it the day after that and I think, actually, I can work with this. Actually, there's something here. It swings back and forth and you never know. And so I agree, it has to be about some way in which art lights up existence for us. It has to be something about the act of making art feels itself, not because of some product we sell that has some life in the world, but because of the way of being that is making art. And the narrator thinks a lot about what this is and about what it means to put a frame around a piece of the world. And he thinks about this when he's reading a poem about a sparrow. And he thinks if a poem is a frame you put around an individual sparrow, he thinks about this in terms of other human beings. In order to live our lives, we have to shut down a huge amount of our sensorial apparatus. We cannot move through the world, if we are perceiving the world in a way that is adequate to the world. We can't look at things. I am living right now in New York City. If I imagine just walking down my block and trying actually to perceive every human being I'm passing, like to perceive in the sense that what I absolutely believe is reality, which is that every single one of those lives has a value that is infinite, that is exactly equal to my own, has the same purchase on the world's resources, on the world's attention as my own life, that their desires are as urgent as my own desires, their needs as urgent as my own needs. We cannot live. And that means that almost all the time, we live in a way that is radically inadequate to reality. And I think that is actually devastating for the project of humanness. And I think in some ways, a lot of the dysfunction in our world comes from the fact that the structures we have created for ourselves to inhabit require such an intense shutting down of our perceptual apparatus. I thought about this a lot. I live part of the year in New York now, but I spent 2 full years in New York. And I found it, I love lots of things about New York, but I found it kind of devastating to live here because I felt more intensely here something that is true everywhere, but this way in which, in order to walk down the street, I have to shut down my sight and I have to shut down my moral perceptions as well. Well, in art, if you can take a sparrow or a human being or an apple or whatever and put a frame around it, and within that frame, engage the entire apparatus of your humanness and engage with this other being, whether it's Cézanne painting an apple or a novelist writing a life, engage with this other being for once in a way that attempts to be adequate to the claim of that other being. That lights up existence. And when I am writing, I remember when I was a high school teacher and I woke up at 4:30 every morning and wrote for 2 hours before I went in to teach. I remember feeling in those 2 hours, I remember like literally saying to myself the words, "This is real life." And that's what I feel when I write, that there is a way that I am most fully human when I am engaging in art making. because it's the one moment where there is this space in which I can fully engage my human apparatus. And I mean, of course, I'm very skeptical of moral claims made for art or the idea that art makes us better people. I think there are all kinds of problems with that, but also I believe it. And I believe it because I do think if we spend 2 hours or 4 hours or 8 hours a day in that kind of engagement, I do think it changes the way we move through the world the rest of the time. Not perfectly, like the change may be very minor, but I think it's a meaningful change. So we make art because art allows us to exist more fully.
And last question before I take some from the audience, which is just to build off of that, how does love work into that? Because I feel like this book is also in many ways could be read as a love letter to art, a love letter to the narrator's partner, Elle, a love letter to the caregivers, a love letter to home. You know, you've written a lot about, or at least a lot of attention has been given to your writing about sex in the past. And sex is a part of that love, but more so in your previous books. The love I think that you're addressing here includes, but also surpasses the erotic. And I think and again, the book beautifully demonstrates that because sex is literally unavailable to the narrator in this moment of mortal peril. So that then becomes this deeper or different kind of contemplation about the narrator's life with Elle. How does love work into all of this in this book in particular and in your work?
Yeah, so I mean, this narrator, so the book's narrator is the same narrator as my previous books. It's the same guy as narrates What Belongs to You and Cleanness. You don't need to have read those books to read this book. The books are independent, but they do have points of contact. And this is a narrator who has been attached to a sense of his life as adventure. Geographical adventure. My first two books are about an American abroad in Eastern Europe. And also, as you say, even more erotic adventure. And now, in his early 40s, he is 7 years into a long-term relationship and he lives in the American heartland. And in a certain way, I think, when we meet him, he is in a place as he's entering middle age that I think is maybe not all that uncommon a place where he feels a little disappointed in his life, and maybe he even resents his life a little bit in a way that I think maybe a lot of us resent our lives a little bit, maybe just because they are our single lives. And like in his 20s, life seemed like this field of possibility. There were all these choices. And in his 40s, his life is his life. It has solidified around him. And there's a way in which that feels like an affront to his freedom. And certainly, in a way that's connected to what I was talking about before, certainly he has stopped really perceiving his life. And just the experience of dailiness, with his partner, he has stopped really seeing his partner, I think, again, like not in a tragic way, not in a catastrophic way, in a very normal way. He has sort of gotten used to things in a way that has dulled him to his life. And at the beginning of this book, this annihilating pain, this illness, takes that life away from him. And in this paradoxical way, in taking his life away from him, this illness delivers his life back to him. Because when he is swept away from his life in this ICU bed, and when he thinks it is entirely possible that he won't get to go back to his life, well, he sees his life again. He perceives his life again. When Elle comes, this is happening at a crest of a pre-vaccine COVID wave, August 2020. And so there are all sorts of restrictions, and Elle can only come for an hour or two a day. And in those moments, he experiences his love for Elle in a way that is quite hot, in a way that maybe it hadn't been for a while. Not that the love wasn't real. In fact, I think this illness, another thing it does, it in sweeping so much away, one thing it can't sweep away is this love that he and Elle have built a life around. And the fact that it can't sweep it away, we learn about the narrator's childhood in this book. We know that he grew up in a very violent home, in a home where love didn't really have a place. And he has really been convinced, I think, that the kind of relationship in which now he finds himself can really only be a trap. He says at one point that he wonders when he's buying this house, is he like engineering hell for himself in the way that his parents engineered hell, in the way that he's watched his siblings and his friends engineer hell? Like he really thinks marriage can only be hell, maybe. And yet, here is this love, the reality of which is undeniable in the face of what he's facing. And I think another great gift this illness gives him, and we're talking a lot about sort of dark things, but actually, I think this is a very happy book. I think this is a book that is very much on the side of life. Like, I think he comes to understand, maybe for the first time fully, that this love is real. And that also domesticity, day-to-day life with another person, the sort of lifelong attempt to know another person, that also is an adventure, that it is accommodating of surprise and mystery and revelation. And I think, for me, the arc of this book is this narrator realizing that this is an adventure he's committed to, that it's an adventure he wants to keep having for as long as he can.
I love it. Thank you. And yes, it's a very I mean, it's an inspirational book. It's philosophical, and yeah. Anyway, it is not. It is dark subjects are discussed, but it is not. No, it does not strike me as a dark book. All right, a few questions from the audience here with our remaining time. First question: can you talk a little more about Bulgaria and your time in Sofia? That experience clearly influenced your first two books, but did it have an effect on your life as a writer in different ways?
Well, I mean, it made me a writer. I feel so strongly. Well, two things made me a writer. I think, I was incredibly lucky. I mean, it's kind of amazing. And when I was teaching high school, I used to tell my students, especially my students who were like really falling apart, which is something that happens in 10th grade, like, especially to boys, they just fall apart. And so, students who would be really misbehaving, really, and I would just say to them, like, you don't scare me. Like, you can't, like, I failed freshman English. Like, nothing you can do would be as bad, as messed up as what I was as a kid. And the fact that, like, this kid who failed freshman English ended up doing PhD work at Harvard and working with really extraordinary poets. When I think about the fact that I got to work with Frank Bedart, Carolyn Forche, Louise Glick, James Longenbach, Henri Cole, Carl Phillips, these extraordinary poets. Like, I had an incredibly elite literary education that I feel immensely grateful for. And I was on a path. Once I got my literature degree, I immediately did an MFA in poetry. Then I immediately started a PhD at Harvard, which I did for 3 years. And then after 3 years, I realized that that path actually was not bearable for me. And that in fact, I could not be the artist. I could not find out what kind of artist I could be if I stayed on that path. And so, to the horror of everyone I knew, including Frank Bedart, who was my most important mentor and whom I love and who has apologized to me for saying this, he said to me when I told him I was going to leave Harvard, he said, if you do this, you will ruin your life. If you leave your Harvard PhD program to go teach high school, you will ruin your life. Well, it turned out that actually it was when I stepped off that path to being a certain kind of poet, a certain kind of professor, that was when I actually began my education as a writer. And being a high school teacher was crucial for that. High school teaching was an education for me in all sorts of ways, but maybe especially a kind of emotional education, an education in caring for other people, in education in observing other people, in becoming interested in the narratives of other people's lives. I am still interested in the narratives of the lives of my students from 2003, 2006, who are doing extraordinary things now. Those narratives still fascinate me. And then taking the further leap when all of my friends thought I had really lost it and going to teach high school in Bulgaria. Somehow that made me a fiction writer. And I think becoming lost, and I did, it is not that I felt full of a transcendent purpose and was sure I was on the right path. I mean, there were real dark times when I thought, too, like I have really messed up, like I am really lost. But it was in that experience of being lost, and especially in the experience of 2 hours every morning writing sentences in my notebook, like that was the path I needed to be on. Like I am a big fan of being bewildered and being lost, and of the idea that you can't really give advice to writers because there is no path to being a writer. And the only path, I think, is pathlessness, getting lost.
Well, that is an inspiration. Seriously. Yes, here's to getting lost and then finding what you find. It's a great question here to pivot from that regarding writing by hand. When and how in the editing process does the digital transfer occur? And do you have any tips about this?
That's a great question. So when I have a complete draft, and I am a very anxious person. And so like when I have a certain number of pages in my notebook, I start thinking the house is going to burn down, like I'm going to lose the notebook. This is all going to be lost. So at a certain point when it's not scientific, it's just when I feel anxious enough, I take photographs of the pages and like upload them to the cloud so that if I lose my notebook, I still have, the years of work that are a novel. But it's when I have a complete draft, I will type up my draft. I hate this. It is so tedious. And it's especially tedious because I try as much as possible to make it a true copy. I try not to revise as I do this. But
that's interesting. Yeah. As messy as it is,
I will fix obvious like grammatical errors, etc. But I will not be like, oh, I need to insert a scene here. I'm going to write it. I will not do that. I will make a note of that to return to. Like if I see something wrong, I will keep a list of problems to return to. But no, I try to make a true copy and then I print it out. I print it out single-sided. It's not environmentally sound, but single-sided. And then I go back to writing by hand. And my sort of second drafts become these very messy. Again, I will, use the verso of one page when I need to insert. And again, you can find pictures of this on my site. But like when I want to insert text, I start writing on the verso. And very often it does, there are like parallel texts. There's the typed on one side, and then on the back, there's my handwritten, I'm rewriting a scene. So it's still I'm printing things out in order to continue writing by hand. But then again, and when I finish that second draft, it goes back into the computer. I print it out again, and that's how I work through drafts. I really believe in writing by hand. I never really revise on the computer. And again, I don't think this is the right way to do it. Like the right way to do it is the way that works for you. But I never revise on the computer. I might very late in the process edit on the computer, like punctuation. Even that makes me uneasy. I really love, like for me, the hand, that sort of physical primordial contact is really important.
Question regarding love and neuroticism. Okay. As a writer, sometimes I still worry that friends and family will read things I write as truthfully as possible, say about queerness or sex, etc. And I worry what they'll think of me, even if I'm writing fiction. Do you have these fears? And if so, how have you faced that so as not to censor yourself? Great question.
That is such a hard question. The truth is, no one can answer that question for you. Um, every artist has to make their own peace with this question. I do not think there is a right question or a wrong or a right answer or a wrong answer, but every artist has to answer that question for themselves. I do have an answer. It is an answer that I think is hugely problematic. It is actually the answer that was modeled for me by Frank Bedart, and it's something that I admire very much about Frank Bedart, who continues to be, for me, Frank Bedart is the greatest living American writer, certainly for me, the most important American writer, and he is utterly ruthless about this. I mean, he believes the art is what matters, the art is the priority, and everything else is secondary. And I believe some version of that. I don't think I'm as ruthless as he is. But I do think I feel pretty strongly. And look, this also comes from somebody who's basically some version of estranged from his family. Family does not have a lot of meaning for me. So, like, the idea of, like, I mean, my father reading my books, I genuinely do not care. Like, I don't know if he reads them. It has no meaning for me if he reads them. I haven't had contact with my father for decades. My mother reading my books makes me feel a little embarrassed. And I told her, for cleanness, I said, Mom, there are 2 chapters in cleanness that I think probably you shouldn't read, but you can read the rest of it. Um, one of Phil Cly, the wonderful, brilliant novelist, Phil Cly, and short story writer Phil Cly, he said to me when he was a very early reader of Small Rain, and he said to me, he said, thank goodness you've finally written a book I can give to my mom. And I do sort of feel like I have kind of told my mom, I'm like, Mom, this book's okay. You can read this book. Like, I don't think this book is going to make you worry too much about your son. But, finally, I do think, like, the thing I can do with my life is make the art that I need to make. Like, that is what I can do with my life that feels meaningful. And I am pretty ruthless about not letting other people, even not letting the question of will this hurt other people who do not deserve to be hurt. I do not think that is a justifiable stance to take, but it is the stance I take. Because for me, the meaning my life has is art, and the art that I can make if I am utterly and as ruthlessly as I can bear committed to that art.
I think this will be our final question, and it regards sentence making and love. Garth, do you think there's anything we can learn from the art of sentence making in order to be better in the art of love?
That is a beautiful question. I love whoever wrote that question. Thank you. I mean, I'm going to say, I'm not sure I believe this, but I'm going to say yes. That actually, I think if we are utterly attentive to the sentence we're writing, if we are attuning ourselves as best we can, not just to our sense of will and what we want a sentence to say, but instead to the energy of the sentence itself. So that writing a sentence, and when I'm writing well, I feel this, writing a sentence is actually, it's not just me. And I don't mean this mystically, but it's not just my will, my intention. It is instead a kind of collaboration that does feel erotic to me. And it's a collaboration with syntax, with the sort of rules of syntax that mean sentences are supposed to move in one way or another. And that's a kind of pressure at work in a sentence. And it's also a kind of collaboration with a tradition in which I'm writing and with the sort of dozens and dozens of poems that I've memorized and the thousands of hours that I've spent reading Henry James and Virginia Woolf and Thomas Mann. That is an erotic collaboration. And I think also, if we can be as daring as our art challenges us to be, if we can follow our art, and this is something that I feel, again, if I'm writing well, I am very likely pretty freaking terrified of where my writing might take me. So that kind of training and a kind of courage and steadfastness, I think those are all virtues that transfer pretty well to commitment to another human being and to the kind of collaboration that is a romantic and erotic commitment to another human being. I'm not sure if I believe that, but I think I might believe that.
I love it. Thank you, Garth. This has been so fantastic. Thank you so much. What a treat.
Thank you.
Yes, I can't believe it, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Garth, for such a beautiful reading, and to both of you for that truly inspiring conversation. I could listen to you both for another hour. Just a reminder to consider purchasing Small Rain from your local bookseller or bookshop. The link is in the chat. And please consider subscribing to Poets and Writers magazine so we can keep coming together and listening to thoughtful conversations such as this one. We did record this evening's program, so look back on our website, pw.org, in the coming days for a video so you can relive all the excitement. Thanks again, Garth and Brian, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Garth.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.